So, of course, I am honored to be here giving the James Arthur Lecture, but I am also overwhelmed and slightly mortified because I know the history of this lecture. I've been to other meetings, and I really am kind of speechless at the thought. And when Howard first approached me to do this, I thought, well, what can I possibly tell these people? I'm certainly not an expert in horology. The story I told is the longitude story, but they already know that. So whatever will I talk to them about? And I thought the only thing I could do is tell the story of what has happened since longitude. And Howard said, well, okay, that would be fine. So here I am. So I want to be on record thanking Will Andrews for organizing and hosting the original Longitude Symposium in 1993. And I had, and I just want to say again, Will, thank you. I'm ever in your debt. So I had met Will about a year before at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which coincided with a meeting of the Astrolabe Society. And Will talked to me about his work at Harvard. He had this fabulous collection of historical scientific instruments. And the exhibition space wasn't great. And he really was hoping for some rich alum to put up the money to improve the museum. And we thought if I wrote an article for Harvard Magazine about the collection, that might happen. So sometime later, I went to visit him in Harvard to discuss this article. But now he was on to the symposium he was planning, this Longitude Symposium. And that I should write about that, because that was really a great story. And I tried. At the time, I was a full-time freelance magazine writer, and I went to everybody I was working for, beginning with Harvard Magazine, who turned me down pretty quickly. National Geographic turned me down, the New Yorker turned me down, and it really looked like a failed proposal, which happens from time to time. And then the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences discovered that Will had gotten Alistair Cook to be the banquet speaker. And suddenly, there was a lot of interest in this symposium, which was pretty interesting in itself. I mean, 500 people from 17 countries, and a 3-day packed program. So they called me, the magazine called me and said, you think you could drop everything and come up after all? Now we were just 3 days before. So I went, and to say that it changed my life would be an understatement. But I mean, of course, I didn't know what was going to happen. So for 3 days, I just sat with my chin on the floor, because here was this truly unbelievable story. People were in this history I had heard of all my life, but I didn't know they were involved with this longitude problem, which I didn't know had been a problem. I mean, I was completely ignorant. In journalism, there's, and the story, not only did it have these famous scientists, it had this guy who had come out from nowhere and solved a problem that all the greatest minds of Europe had failed to solve, and there were pirates and shipwrecks. And in journalism, this kind of story is called a man bites dog story. So it's the kind of story, it's great even before anybody sits down to tell it. And of course, you have seen these wonderful machines, absolutely magnificent. I apologize, but it's kind of a a shipboard field editor. I won't put up anything you have to read. They'll just be pictures. Again, this was news to me. Jonathan Betts, who was at the time the curator of the Harrison clocks at the Royal Observatory, was at the meeting talking about them. Everybody was there. And of course, you know that although I have the fourth timekeeper blown up as large as the other clocks, it was in fact a marvel of miniaturization. This is George Daniels, and he was the James Arthur lecturer at the Longitude Symposium, as the acknowledged greatest watchmaker in the world. So you can understand why I was a little bit intimidated to give that same named lecture. And I still remember his talk. And I don't remember much at my age. So my article appeared as a cover story in the March-April 1994 issue of Harvard Magazine. And then when you open to the article, there was this fabulous 2-page spread with this painting of the wreck of the Amsterdam, really giving you the flavor of the thing. And immediately, extraordinary things started to happen. So Harvard Magazine goes to all the alumni, of course, and many other groups of people too. But a particular alum who was living in New York and was an editor at a small family-owned publishing house. He'd been a history major at Harvard, and he read that story, and he thought he had an idea for a series of science books that would appeal to people who would not identify themselves as being interested in science. And when he read this story, he thought, this could be the first book in that series. And he called the magazine and got my phone number and asked me if I had enough material to turn the article into a book. Remember, this was for a year a failed proposal for a magazine story. Now it's a book overnight. I don't even have to do anything to convince this publisher. And he really got it. He said, I see this as the biography of a scientific instrument. I can tell you most editors have no idea what they really want. And so it was very refreshing to realize right away that this person was going to be wonderful to work with, which indeed he was. And I, having been to the Longitude Symposium, I of course went back to all the people who had been there. That's often the hardest part of a research project, is figuring out what do I have to read, who are the people I should be talking to. So the research went very smoothly. What was odd was the reaction of people. Friends know I'm a writer, they always ask, what are you working on? And I said, I'm writing a book about how the problem of finding position at sea was solved. And people would just look down. You know, it's just laughable. And I remember my son, who was about 10 at the time, he asked me, do you really think anybody's going to read this? And honestly, I used to say, outside of my mother and a small circle of friends, maybe not. But I want you to understand, I'm loving what I'm doing. This is fascinating. I'm working with an editor who is as excited about this subject as I am. I jump out of bed in the morning to go to work. Not many people can say that. So he got it. And yeah. So one of the things I did, of course, was to visit the Watch and Clock Museum in Columbia. I'm wearing a little piece of jewelry that I bought there 30 years ago. And you've all been there. But again, as a newcomer to this world, the library had the overflow from what I assumed was the overflow from the exhibition space, and everything was working, so that chimes went off on the hour, the half hour, the quarter hour, noon. It was like a 21-gun salute. It was just a very unusual experience to be in a library with that many clocks. And at that museum, I read a book called, so I had a weekend to read everything related to longitude. And I read a book called The Pulse of Time by Silvio Bettini, which was all about Galileo's work on the longitude problem. And that book contained a letter from Galileo's daughter, who was a nun, who had been given the assignment of fixing the clock in her convent. And she hadn't been able to do it. So now she was writing home to Dad, could he please help? And I just fell off the chair, you know. So that was where Galileo's daughter came from. Another thing that happened en route to this was, I kept thinking nobody would read this book, but a couple of people asked me, have you read any of the books by Patrick O'Brien? And I hadn't, but I immediately got Master and Commander and read it, and I thought, oh, the people who are reading his books are the people who actually might read my book. And when you write a book, your publisher wants you to tell them everybody you know who might write a nice comment to put on the jacket. Well, we approached Patrick O'Brien, he's very secretive, reclusive, but we got to him, and he loved the book and wrote a book, and there it was on the back of the jacket. And the book was beautifully published, just everything about it, the small size, the artwork on the cover. A friend of mine who's a writer told me she had paper envy of the quality of the paper in the book. So, it was all very thrilling, just to see it appear. And then even more unusual things started happening. So on New Year's Eve that year, it was 1995, there was a leap second inserted into UTC. And the Times wanted me to write about this because I was now seen as an expert on time. The other thing that happened was that Longitude appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. So it was number 14, right between All I Know About Animal Behavior I Learned in Logan's Dressing Room by Herbert and Days of Our Lives, which was a story of the long-running soap opera. And what really got me was, in the Times bestseller list, there's always just a one-line description of the book. So their description was, the story of John Harrison, the 18th century Englishman who invented the chronometer. This is a bestseller? I mean, it just, the whole thing just seemed so improbable. And another improbable thing was that I finally got mentioned in my high school newsletter. all these years now, I told them about the births of my two adorable children. I had a job at the New York Times. It wasn't until Longitude that I got mentioned in the Wrong Science newsletter. And there was a fantastic typo in the description of the book. So instead of the lone genius, he was a love genius. And I thought, well, now we're talking about a bestseller. But this is a real deal. This book followed. This was Will's editing of the entire proceedings of the Longitude Symposium. Gorgeously illustrated, authoritative, I refer to it. I get a lot of mail. People ask me questions all the time, and I go to this book. Here's one of the inside layouts. You can see how beautifully it's done. And then Will and I collaborated on an illustrated edition of Longitude, because the complaint everybody had was, here's this story that has beautiful machines, maps, people, and there are no pictures. How could that be? So, and the publisher had made a conscious decision not to include a photo insert because they were worried that would make it look like a textbook. I'm just telling you what. So we had this book, and then there was a Nova episode called Lost at Sea, The Search for Longitude, in which Will was actually filmed on a sailing ship using some instruments to demonstrate the problem and why it was so important to come up with a timekeeper solution. I was a talking head for about 5 minutes in this, and when it was aired in England, I was removed. And the narrator, the American narrator, Richard Dreyfuss, who was a pretty well-known actor at the time, they took him out and replaced him with some BBC staff member who had proper English pronunciation. Then there was a made-for-TV movie, a 3-hour made-for-TV movie, and a very short book, but fantastic. And Jeremy Irons played Rupert Gould, and Michael Gambon played John Harrison. Michael Gambon was fairly well known here. He was star of a series called The Singing Detective, a few other things. Really a fantastically respected actor, and this film was a kind of low-budget project for someone of his stature. But Michael Gambon is an amateur clockmaker and could not resist the chance to portray John Harrison. So he got, and he won a BAFTA, British, it's like an Oscar. Other people who enjoyed the story responded to it in their way. There were several musical compositions written. This one, Peter Graham. I must admit I've never heard it. And this was about Harris. The music was to convey Harrison's struggle. There was another piece that was supposed to give you the feeling of the running of the clocks. And that composer's name is Harrison Birtwistle. This is Jonathan Betts, who was one of the speakers at the Longitude Symposium, and who has also been a master of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. And one of the outcomes of the general interest in Longitude and Harrison was the creation by the Guild of the Harrison Medal. And Jonathan was awarded the first Harrison Medal. I forget what year we're up to now, it must be early 2000s. And Will had moved on from the collection of historical scientific instruments at Harvard and created his own business, artisanship, really, making these magnificent sundials, which he calls the Longitude dial. And they are based on mnemonic map projections. So if you are lucky enough to get one of these dials, your location is mapped as the center of the world. And then the globe is unfolded around it, and you get a flat plate where the meridians of longitude on the map become the hour lines of the sundial. And so here's Will, and this is a local person we hired near where I live to mount the dial on a pedestal on many feet of concrete into the ground. So it is a permanent installation. More about that later. Oh, here it is. And you can see the beauty of the design, how it has elements of a fine 18th century timepiece. And it also functions as a nephoscope because the surface is very shiny. So here you're just seeing a reflection of the clouds passing overhead. So 10 years went by from the publication of Longitude. I'm not watching the time.
You're good.
I'm good, okay. And the publisher wanted to put out a 10th anniversary edition. And he said, we need something to add to the book. It can't just be the book as it was 10 years later. We need a foreword by somebody famous. Can you think of anyone? Well, the first person I thought of was Neil Armstrong, because when they came back from the moon and they traveled around the world to talk about what they had experienced, at 10 Downing Street, Armstrong toasted Mr. Harrison for being the one who had started them on their journey. So I knew that he knew this story long before I came to it, and that if we could get to him, he would probably agree. And that's what happened, because at the time, he had authorized his biography by this person, James Hansen, and Hansen's agent approached my agent about selling rights to this book in foreign countries, and suddenly a path to Neil Armstrong opened up. And he did say yes. And he wrote the foreword. And that still just knocks me out. I'm sorry to tell you, when I talk to school children, a lot of them don't know who he is. This is my brother Steve, a great supporter all my life, and continues to be. And so he designed this T-shirt because he was so proud and happy about what had happened with Longitude. He is a sailor. He's not sailing anymore. He's 84, but this, I actually took this picture of him when we were just out for the day. And he's a dentist and was on the faculty at USC. And Neil Armstrong was the commencement speaker that year. It must have been 2000, I want to say 2007, 8. If I were looking at my notes, I would tell you. But it was important to Steve, who, I mean, the two of us are complete space cadets. We even went to space camp together as adults. So he wanted to get a T-shirt to Neil Armstrong and somehow arrange that. And then Armstrong wrote him the nicest thank you note, which said in part that he was going to wear it on special occasions and whenever he felt lost, because he said, I'm one of those men who hates to ask for directions. This is Sir Arnold Wesker. So we had a television show, we had a movie, now we have a stage play. And this play was put on at the Greenwich Theater, so right near the observatory. Perfect, right? For a month. And I don't remember why I couldn't get there during the month, but I couldn't. But a lot of the people from the observatory went and said, yeah, it was fun, we all enjoyed it. It was a chorus of dead sailors who sang sea it's the greatest compliment when somebody reads something you've written and then says, I'm inspired to do something else. So this was great. Well, eventually the script reached me, and the explanation of Longitude is wrong. How would that get by everybody? in the excitement of being the show with the dead sailors. This may be the best thing that happened. So people started writing to me to say, I'm actually a descendant of John Harrison, and I want to thank you for telling this story. Well, John Harrison's lineage is very well known, and I knew a lot of these people probably were not his descendants, but I didn't feel it was my responsibility to disabuse them of that notion. So one person was persistent. She said, considering the popularity of this book in England, would you help me? I've been trying to get a memorial to him placed in Westminster Abbey, and nobody is listening to me. But if you wrote a letter, maybe something would happen. And very shortly, and I wrote the letters and nothing happened. And then I happened to meet the Astronomer Royal, Sir Arnold Wesker. And he is a great antiquarian clock enthusiast. So I told him about this situation. And he said, well, I'm just the troublemaker who could make this happen. And he certainly was. Next thing I knew, we were walking around Westminster Abbey, picking out a spot for the memorial. It's right near Thomas Tompion and George Graham. And it was designed by the Clockmakers Guild, and it has in it a bimetallic strip. So perfect, right? Just tasteful. This was dedicated and unveiled in 2006 by Prince Philip, and a huge to-do with music and speeches. And while this was being prepared, I said, what about this woman who started the whole thing? Shouldn't she be there? Shouldn't she have some role? And he said, well, the problem is, she's not really a descendant. that was why nobody was listening to her all along. Nevertheless, she made this happen, and she was invited. She didn't have any official role, but she was there. And then, today is October 22nd. And so when I was first invited, that seemed like yet another one of these phenomenal coincidences that keeps happening to me. Because that's the date of the Admiral Shuttle disaster. It was October 22nd, 1707. So on October 22nd, 2007, there was a gathering at the Isles of Scilly that included the Astronomer Royal, and we all got on a Royal Navy minesweeper and went out to the area of where the ships had been destroyed on the rocks, and we threw wreaths into the water. It was really very moving. And so this is an aerial view, and when you get out into those western rocks, that is a horrible sight. Just like the jaws of a shark was what I thought of when I saw those rocks. What else could happen? This is one of my favorite things. I got a letter from Elena Montrasio of Milan, thanking me. She was a contestant on the Italian version of So You Want to Be a Millionaire. And she said, because I read your book, I was able to answer the €70,000 question. No. And here's one of the very best things. Do you all know about National History Day? So this is a high school competition, and kids compete at the local, state, and if they're lucky, national level. And I started getting messages from high school students who wanted to do a project about John Harrison. And I've spoken to many of these kids over the years, and they really give me faith in the future. They work so hard. They are so earnest. I spoke to one kid who had chosen Copernicus, and he had actually read De Revolutionibus. I said, do you know you're doing college level work? Maybe graduate school level work. So it's very encouraging. This is Sarah Sadler. She went to a school in Washington State, and she did her project, as you can see, about the marine chronometer. She went all the way to the nationals, and she took first prize in the naval history section. And 2 years later, her teacher was kind enough to let me know that she had been accepted at Stanford, Brown, and Williams College. This really has nothing to do with me, but you may be aware that the Naval Academy had stopped teaching. It was the sextant and navigation, not by GPS. And then they came to their senses and have since reinstated it, I think since about 2015. So here's Will again. This is taken at the Mystic Seaport, where the wonderful exhibition Ships, Clocks, and Stars toured. It was one of the tour stops, but it was also in England at the observatory. It went to Sydney. It went to the Folger Library in Washington, and maybe moving out a couple of places. And it traveled with these replicas of the Harrison clocks. Really, so you could actually see everything spinning and moving. It was really, really just something quite wonderful. As I think was mentioned, my most recent project is about Marie Curie. And I'm very mindful of time and its importance in many areas of study. And certainly when it comes to radioactivity, time played a pivotal role in the discovery of these elements that were found in such tiny amounts. You couldn't say what color they were or what they smelled like or any kind of typical chemical property. But by timing how quickly they would create an electrical current, they could actually detect the radioactivity. And then the elements all decayed according to a certain half-life, also dependent on timing. So this is obviously a staged photograph of Marie and Pierre and their colleague Gustave Gambon, because they were not chemists, and they really needed help breaking down the ore to get at what they presumed was a new element in the ore. So this is their apparatus, and you can't quite see what she's holding here, but it's a chronometer. So I thought that was kind of thrilling, and it brought my life full circle. But this really got me. So radium, for about 20 years, was the cure for cancer. And so, aside from her 2 Nobel Prizes, she was famous, world famous, as a great humanitarian. And on 2 occasions, she was invited to the United States and given a gift of a gram of radium, which was worth $100,000 on her first visit in 1921. So how are they going to send the radium home with her? By now they know you don't just put it in your pocket. At first they didn't know that, but now they do know. So they had the radium in the form of radium chloride, and they had 10 little test tubes full, and together in there is a gram of radium. And they pack it in lead, and they put it in this box. Does this look familiar to you? This is a chronometer box. So here we are again. And this is how it went back on the ship back to back to Paris with her. It wasn't until the mid-1920s when the horror of the radium girls, and these young women were painting luminous dials on watches. And they were instructed to, and the paint really did contain radium, not Madame Curie's idea. And they were told to put the paintbrush into their mouths to bring the tip to a fine point to paint these very neat numerals on the watch faces. And of course the radium stayed in their bodies and destroyed their jaws and everything else. And by the time she learned about that, she was very sympathetic, but again, any commercial use was never what she intended. Another outcome of Longitude is that my nephew Dan became an amateur watch maker. He's completely self-taught, buys things on, I'm just about there. Buys things online and then fixes them. And because he's a smart boy, he also bought a Geiger counter. I wanted to talk about Clock B, but maybe you all know about Clock B. This really had nothing to do with me, but how wonderful that everything Harrison claimed he could do, he really could do, and it's been proven to the satisfaction of all. So to close, I'm coming back to the longitude dial, and on the dial is the Radium stone, which is a small work of art by a Japanese artist who lives in London, and I have it with me because one of her projects was to send this stone to various people and ask them to photograph it in a place that was meaningful to them. And it has on it the coordinates 0 degrees, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. So here it is on my dial. And it's a wonderful sort of inspirational piece. It makes you think, where am I? You know, the juxtaposition, or where am I in relation to you? Where are we in the course of our lives? And where to?